Thanks, Chris Rea. This next panel is worth the price of admission for the whole conference. This is probably the three most highly regarded counterterrorism experts in the history of modern counterterrorism. When we talked about the people on this panel, Brian Jenkins, Bruce Hoffman, and Dame Louise Richardson, moderated by Peter Bergen, I said, you know, that's a pretty heavy panel to have all those people together. And they said, we call it the Mount Rushmore panel. And, you know, it's not just the three heavyweight experts who were talking about counterterrorism way before anybody was talking about it at the depth they are. It's also about the moderator, who, if there was a Mount Rushmore, would also be on it. Peter Bergen, you know, I start a lot of these conversations by saying I was the last Western journalist to interview Osama bin Laden. Here's the thing. Peter Bergen was the first. Like most of the counterterrorism stories in this realm, he got there way before me, figured it out first, and did the first warning. And he is not just a journalist, but a prolific author. There's a lot of books out there, but whatever the book's about in the terrorism realm, he also wrote it first. So this will be interesting, stimulating, and challenging. Let's welcome our panel.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Soufan group for putting this on. By the way, I thought you had to be dead if you were on Mount Rushmore. But I don't think, none of us appear to be dead, so that's a good thing. So let me, I guess, you know, the news of the day, and we're going to talk about a lot of things about, you know, what are the lessons of the last decades of counterterrorism policy and research. But I just wanted to get, since it's on everybody's mind, just start with Dame Louise, your reaction to what happened in Doha yesterday.
Is that any better? Yes. My first reaction, I have to say, was surprise. Second reaction was deep concern as to what this might portend. To take out, or to attempt to take out the people with whom you are negotiating is an extraordinary move. And it also revealed the fact that Israeli intelligence is not as good as we all thought it was, because, of course, the attack failed. But I think it is a very concerning moment, and it is likely to have all kinds of unanticipated consequences. It's possible that these consequences were anticipated by some. For example, it could provide an excuse for some people to withdraw from the Abraham Accords, which again could be quite destabilizing. So all in all, I thought, I don't actually see this so much as a terrorism action, however. I see it more as the action of a state. And I worry if we treat the behavior of states as in the same way as we treat the behavior of sub-state actors, that we make it more difficult to analyze effectively the behavior of the sub-state actors. I think we have international law to help us adjudicate the behavior of states, and this was clearly a state action.
Bruce?
I thought I was going to avoid that. Dame Louise would give the only answer. You know, in this day and age, I can't say I'm surprised. I mean, think of how many red lines have been crossed in just the past 2 years. And for those, and there are many right now, including some students at my university who are no longer interested in terrorism, who thinks it's passé, that it's an old field. I mean, it shows the complexity of countering terrorism. It shows that as terrorism has gotten more complex and more difficult, this point about red lines, I mean, I'm waiting for the next one. What could the next one be? I mean, we've seen so much in the past 2 years that I think has changed so profoundly our understanding of terrorism. And it's such seismic repercussions amongst our societies I mean, this is just the next one. I mean, we have to prepare for what's in the future, but it's so uncertain. But it underscores, I think, really the ongoing threat of terrorism and how this phenomena and the phenomenon of counterterrorism is constantly evolving, not necessarily always in positive directions.
And Brian, and just, Bruce sort of alluded to this, but we had the attack by India on a Sikh separatist who they obviously consider to be a terrorist in Canada, what was it, 2 years ago? So the red lines around these kinds of responses to what states consider to be terrorists, and often they are terrorists, but sometimes you could debate it. So is this new, or is this something made new again, or is this, how do you sort of score it?
That's right.
Yeah.
There are a couple of things going on long term. I mean, one is that what we are really saying, and Bruce alluded to this, is something beyond terrorism here, and this is going to sound strange coming from me, who have spent my professional life studying terrorism. We ought not to get ourselves too wrapped around the term terrorism linguistically or conceptually. I mean, what we really see here is a mixture, increasingly so, of warfare, guerrilla warfare, terrorism, counterterrorism, as everyone has pointed out, reaching new levels. So this is a blurring, really, a further blurring of state violence and terrorism and counterterrorism. Our military has several times preferred to put these in separate containers, separate corridors, and those have completely fallen apart. Terrorism will be an aspect of every future war, and increasingly in war between states, terrorist tactics are becoming assassinations, things of this sort, as you point out. So that's one development. The second thing is that we are seeing, I think increasingly in recent time, the increasing exercise of just naked power. That is, norms, rules, diplomacy, things of this sort, have not really been any sort of, have been a really minimal constraint and a declining one on what countries are willing to do. And so whether it's detain people as a means of diplomatic coercion, or whether it is assassinations hardly disguised, or continuing forms of more subtle, more insidious forms of warfare. All of these things are going on at once. And as I say, well, we talk about terrorism, that's sort of, we tend to then, we're going to focus on this narrow, isolated a stripe of this. And that is simply not today's reality.
Yeah, which raises an interesting question, which I'll, Dame Louise, start with you, which is, to what extent has the United States led the way in much of this? So when we talked about assassination, the drone program in countries that we're nominally allied to, like Pakistan, probably killed, near America where I work, we calculate 3,000 people, probably 6% of them were civilians during the Obama time, a higher number under Bush. And that has sort of basically stopped now, but it continues in Somalia and other places. So the rules of the road have sort of changed, and I think the United States led the way. Armed drones really didn't exist until just after 9/11. Now they've been used in 23 conflicts. So there's a technology piece to this, because you can do it, you have the technology, you can kill somebody 3,000 miles away on the other side of the world in a particular house with some degree of accuracy. And at the same time, there's also a legal and ethical kind of question here. So just if you could meditate on, this has obviously been a key part of our CT kind of approach. It's obviously been pretty successful in terms of destroying, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS or other groups. And yet, on the other hand, you know, the monopoly on that technology is basically evaporated, and other countries are going to follow our lead, I think. Dame Louise.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I agree. There's no doubt the U.S. has led the way in this. The other trend I think that's happening is that, and you've alluded to this, weapons of greater and greater lethality are falling into the hands of fewer and fewer people, and that makes counterterrorism. Sorry, I beg your pardon. What I was saying was that one of the trends is that weapons of greater and greater lethality are falling into the hands of fewer and fewer people, and that enormously complicates the task of counterterrorism, especially for a country like the US. I think you're right that we have led the way in this by declaring a war on terror and on terrorism. And I've always felt that was mistaken, that terrorism is a tactic. And the goal is to render the tactic unsuccessful. That's how you defeat it, rather than elevating the stature of those who practice it by the most powerful country in the world declaring war on them. It elevates their stature. But I think you're right that it is a new age, and that weapons like drones are falling into the hands of fewer and fewer people. So we're seeing the US approach was, as you said, successful against groups like ISIS who tried to establish territory, and that is something that we know how to counter very effectively. But it's much more difficult to counter alienated young men in their bedrooms being inspired by what they're reading on the internet or are being presented to them via AI, and using a high-tech but very lethal weapon to kill Americans and others.
Brian?
You know, yeah, drones are new, and drones are in a sense certainly going to change the nature of the battlefield. In terms of the U.S. leading the way on this, certainly we're in the forefront of using the technique of really attempting to decapitate these terrorist groups, and that has ranged further and further. Technically, if we go to the rules of war, if you are at war with a belligerent, if you accept that you are at war, then the elimination of enemy commanders is within the rules. I know we go back to World War II, and there was an issue when we had intelligence, the U.S. had intelligence that Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was going to be on a certain flight, and we had an opportunity to do that. Now, that decision went all the way up to the White House to decide, but we did it. We did it. So that's not new, and that's not out of the rules.
But Brian, let me sort of, on that, wasn't Yamamoto over international waters for what it's worth? I don't know. He wasn't.
Yes.
He wasn't on the territory of an ally.
That is true.
Right.
And I'm not sure that would have necessarily made a difference. But,
Right.
But it is arguable. On the other hand, the issue of state-sponsored assassinations. I mean, we go back centuries and centuries to find lots of historical examples of that. And in a sense, since we mentioned the U.S., I mean, the U.S. was revealed to have been involved in plots to kill Fidel Castro and other plots during the 60s. So we have, as the British say, we have form on this issue. But again, state-sponsored assassinations of dissidents, I'll go back to Trotsky and others, state-sponsored assassinations of other leaders, North Korea's attempt to wipe out the South Korean government in Rangoon, Burma, lots of historical precedent. So that's not itself new. What we may be reacting to now is that for perhaps a brief period, not even that long, we thought that at the end of World War II, there was going to be more of a world order, and that we weren't going to see so much of this kind of activity. That has turned out not to be the case even during the Cold War, from what we know now. And in today's environment, warfare is increasingly continuous. It involves, again, this whole spectrum of activities, some clandestine, some overt, and increasingly the issue that might, just naked might, will not be contained. And that presages a very rough world.
Bruce, your most recent book was about right-wing terrorism. What was your reaction to the pardons of the January 6 rioters?
Well, it underscores what I said at the beginning, is just how complex terrorism and counterterrorism is becoming. Look, nearly 24 people were convicted on the most serious criminal charge in the United States, which is seditious conspiracy. And that's a very difficult charge to prove. In fact, in 1988, when 14 white supremacists were charged with it, they walked away scot-free and have breathed new life into the movement. So you don't have to be Kreskin to say that when now people were convicted but are released, when the slate's wiped clean, is there any deterrent left? Is what we saw on January 6th, was it a mirage? Did it not matter? I mean, in my book, when you assault federal officers, when you're chanting to lynch and execute a sitting vice president of the United States, who happens to be one of your kind in the sense of an evangelical Republican, and then we turn our backs on it and say it's okay, this can't but have deleterious effects on our approach to terrorism, and it can only strengthen those. I mean, part of the problem, and Brian always wrote very eloquently about this, is that terrorism is such a malleable phrase. And it's, if you identify with the victim, then it's terrorism. If you identify with the perpetrator, it's something else. And unfortunately, what we see, not just with January 6th, but in many cases, I mean, gosh, there's many things I never thought I would see. I'm 50 years almost of studying terrorism. Brian still has a couple of decades on me. But one of them was near here in Washington Square Park at the end of February, a celebration of the life of Saeed Hassan Nasrallah. I mean, with the exception of bin Laden, is there a terrorist in the world who had more American blood on his hands than Nasrallah? Bombings of the US embassies in 1983 and 1984 in Beirut, Marine barracks bombing, kidnapping and execution of Lieutenant Colonel William Higgins, and so on. And yet we have a rally in the United States to celebrate him and to mourn his death, which shows how our values on terrorism and counterterrorism are becoming so corrupted. Now, there's some reason for it, because the moral ambiguity that Dame Louise and Brian were talking about, the assassinations of individuals on allied countries and so on, targeted killings that also involve the deaths of civilians. I mean, this has all become much murkier, but we're
Well, to push back just a little bit gently on that, Bruce, I mean, the First Amendment's the First Amendment, right? So, as you know, Holocaust denial in Germany is a crime. As you know, in Britain, inciting racial hatred is a crime in the way that is not here. So isn't it just part of the American tradition to have a celebration of somebody that you may well disagree with very profoundly?
I think in this case, though, it's taking it to a different level. I mean, as I said, not just an enemy of the United States, but someone with so much blood on his hands that there's little to commend him. And then you have, obituaries in the New York Times that talk about him and portray him as this great peacemaker that sought to bring peace in the Middle East and to bring Jews and Muslims and Druze and Maronites together. I mean, it's all nonsense.
Well, I'm reminded, Bruce, the New York Times ran a piece by Siraj Haqqani, and they identified him as the deputy leader of the Taliban. They forgot to mention that, amongst other things, he kidnapped a reporter for the New York Times.
Well,
so, I mean, people are...
My point's not to violate anyone's First Amendment
Yeah.
rights. It's just to lament this kind of moral ambiguity or moral muddiness that has become so much more commonplace now compared to 24 years ago.
Okay, so, I mean, part of the portrayal that we're hearing is things are really bad right now, but I wanted that you all know very well that in the 1970s, the United States and 60s, there was a lot of political violence, and I won't rehearse what it's all well known. But I'm struck by a dog that sort of hasn't barked, which is the lack of lethal left-wing terrorism. And you know, when we're looking over the last, say, you know, since 9/11, it's one of those things that hasn't happened. And in a very polarized environment in which we now live, are you surprised that we're not seeing more of it, or do you predict that there might be more of it? And I'll start with Dame Louise.
Thank you. I'm hoping this works this time.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Well, we anticipate more violence domestically from the right, as Bruce has written so eloquently about. One would expect, with polarization, the way our society has become polarized, that there might be more terrorism on the left, but you're right, we haven't seen that. It depends a little on how you define the left. Where we might see it is from people who are energized and mobilized by what's been happening in the Middle East. And I certainly wouldn't be surprised if we were to see violence from those who object to our support for Israel. They don't fit neatly into the left-right category, but they're more likely to come from the left. But we haven't seen that yet, and we still may.
Bruce?
Well, it's an asymmetrical threat. I mean, there are reports of upwards of 75,000 militia members of the United States that are well-trained and adept at arms. There are many military veterans about them. It's not to say that there's no left-wing terrorism, it's just asymmetrical. I think why there's so little left-wing terrorism compared to the 1970s is two reasons. One, and you're absolutely right, I think between 1970 and the middle of 1971, there were 1,800 bombings in the United States, which is astonishing.
And for the younger people in the audience, the Weather Underground, the Black Panthers, Puerto Rican nationalists, I mean, there was a whole constellation of these leftist or groups, right?
Right. Most of them were non-lethal. That's why we don't remember them. I mean, obviously the FALN, the Puerto Rican Independistas, and the bombing of Francis Tavern 50 years ago, right near here, killed 4 people and wounded 12. So not all of them were non-lethal, but the vast majority were. But I think there was a big difference, is that the left-wing movement in the United States really petered out after 1975 and became almost inconsequential.
Why was that?
The end of the Vietnam War. I think that that movement confused opposition to U.S. military involvement in Indochina with support for a revolution. And there was no support for a revolution. There was support not to be drafted and to go fight, but by 1975, we had withdrawn from Vietnam. And I think like all terrorist groups, they were desperate for another cause. Now in Europe, Red Army faction in Germany and the Red Brigades in Italy pivoted to what then became the big cause célèbre, which was the Middle East and the Palestinian cause. In the case of the Red Army faction, 2nd of June movement, many of their terrorists trained with the PFLP and with other Palestinian groups. But in the United States, there was no other movement that really animated them. There was a spasm of activity in the 1980s because of U.S. involvement in Central America. But remember, it wasn't military involvement. There were only 55 advisors in El Salvador at the height of the Civil War. There was, of course, a bombing of the Senate cloakroom in the midst of that. But that was about the extent of it. And then, don't forget, all terrorist groups, as my favorite metaphor from Inside Terrorism is that they're like the archetypal shark in the water. They have to move forward to survive, which means they have to attract new sources of support, appeal to new constituencies. In the United States, the left wing failed to do so. I mean, Central America did not animate the same emotions that Indochina did because Americans weren't going there to fight. And I think that legacy has continued today, that we will see terrorism from the left. We've already seen some instances, and even some instances that become very difficult to define. I mean, the FBI has a new category now, nihilistic violent extremism, which I think is absolutely appropriate, but you know, where do we categorize that as left or right? Or Luigi Mangione, who now has a play in theaters about him. I mean, do we put that as left or right? But these are nonetheless highly consequential acts that express an opprobrium in society, but can't be pigeonholed so easily.
Well, that raises an interesting question, Brian, which is this sort of the malleability of the boundaries between these categories, which Dame Louise have referred to. If you have a sort of anti-Semitic attack, is it protesting Israel's policies, or is it sort of coming from a leftist perspective? And obviously, it can vary on the individual. But we're seeing, and I think Christopher Wray sort of alluded to this, and we're seeing these hard to categorize kind of people who are, in one group, the incels, for instance, who, they kill quite a lot of people, and they kill women who they don't even know for ideological reasons. And this seems like a new development. So can you meditate a little bit on the question of, I just heard this for the first time, nihilistic violent extremism. You've got these people who it's hard to say what, they certainly want to kill or do something. Their ideology is a little murky. I'm thinking perhaps also the attack at CDC. Was that an anti-vax person? Was that, it's hard to sort out. Was it somebody who was mentally unstable? So if you could just meditate on that a bit.
If you look at some of the official strategies and analyses put out by the U.S. government on domestic terrorism, you end up looking at this extraordinary taxonomy of acronyms of DRVs and AARVs. And we have this notion of trying to categorize these things. One of the long-term trends that we've seen, I believe, over the last several decades is simply the atomization of violence. And this has a real history to it. I mean, when we talk about the 1970s, when you joined a terrorist group in the 1970s, you went underground, so to speak. You joined an identifiable group. You were, in fact, vetted by the others in the group because they worried about infiltrators, they worried about unreliable operatives, and so on. That has changed, and it has changed in part because of technology. And the technology is clearly the internet. We did a study at RAND in the 1970s, and we were attempting to identify all of the weapons that would have consequence for terrorism going forward. And one of the things, of course, that attracted our attention was precision-guided munitions, man-portable precision-guided munitions, so shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. And we thought this might be one of the things that we would be mightily concerned about, and it certainly was a legitimate concern. So we went through all of these, cataloged all of them. We missed the biggest one, the internet. Now, 1979, to our defense, the internet was in its infancy, and no one anticipated what it would turn into. But keep that in mind then. And so fast forward to post 9/11, we are going after Al-Qaeda. We are dispersing them. We are pounding these groups, and it becomes increasingly difficult for them to gather together at a training camp, to have headquarters, to bring together people, to train them, to project them. And instead of the vertical escalation that we were worried about in the post 9/11 environment, we ended up with a horizontal escalation. That is, they adopted this idea of recruiting by remote exhortation, recruiting indirectly through the internet. Now, the fundamental difference here is that instead of joining a group and being vetted into a group, these were self-selectors who, in a sense, could shop for ideologies. And in many cases, we began to see more primitive tactics. We began to see this less organized violence by individuals claiming to do so on behalf of various groups. And in looking at those individuals, part of them were motivated by the ideology. They embrace the ideology, whether far right, far left, anti-this or anti-that. But they were also deeply troubled individuals, and many of them with histories of mental difficulties. And so I know personally would regularly get questions from prosecutors or law enforcement in terms of looking at a specific case, and they would say, well, is this individual crazy or are they a terrorist? My answer was yes. And not having an X-ray for a man's soul, you can't go inside and sort of say, well, it was 3 parts this and 4 parts that. We're not able to do that. So in this atomization of violence, which is being called nihilistic, not a bad term, but we see several things happening. As I say, people who are disturbed, attaching themselves to ideologies that resonate with them and provide, in a sense, a conveyor for their personal discontents. That's one dimension of it. We see at the same time a kind of an international competition, it's almost gamified, in which one is going for a high body count, a spectacular event recorded with a GoPro camera, and in a sense, a worldwide competition, almost as if it is some kind of a video game. These are mass murders with manifestos. Now, again, in our society, our approach, we feel absolutely compelled to, we're like Mendel's peas. We want to sort them out in these categories, and they don't fit. And the future, I think, one of the futures we face is not simply the increasing exercise of raw power by state actors, also the emergence of terrorist proto-states, but at the lowest level, simply this manifestation of violence, which has a sort of a thin ideological veneer.
Well, that's very optimistic. Turning to perhaps, so tomorrow will be the 24th anniversary of 9/11, and obviously next year will be the 25th. I think if we'd had this discussion 2 decades ago, or let's say 23 years ago, it would have been unlikely if one of us had said there will be no large-scale lethal attack on the United States by a foreign terrorist group for the next 2.5 decades. That would have seemed an unlikely claim. The only foreign terrorist group that has carried out an attack in the United States was the Saudi military officer who killed the 3 American sailors at Pensacola Naval Station during the Trump first term, and he was sort of had some connection to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. But that's the exception that proves the rule. So what do we get right? And I'll start with you, Dame Louise.
Thank you. Yes, I think we would have anticipated, and many of us did anticipate there would be further attacks. And here I think we have to give credit to the extraordinary men and women of the security and intelligence services. Our lives are much less comfortable. It's much more cumbersome to travel, but we are more secure in the way we travel. I think the reason there hasn't been any complex attacks like 9/11, and that they are still unlikely, is because we are more cognizant of security and take many more precautions. That said, one of the drawbacks of being in this line of work is you're constantly imagining what you would do if you were one of the bad guys, and there are so many extraordinary things. What this panel could do to fundamentally change this country would be so easy. Pick a couple of men's final, well, that wouldn't have been a good example because there was security in the men's final on Sunday, tennis final. But any large sporting event, and what I live in fear is of some tiny group of individuals putting in an explosion in a densely packed area and doing it again a few weeks later and a few weeks later. And I worry about our ability to maintain our democratic principles in the face of that kind of very, very easy assault. So to date, we have managed to make our borders much more secure, and we have done so while keeping our democratic values and principles. And but I worry about what could still happen.
Bruce?
Well, undeniably, and we have to thank many people in this room, that we've been kept extraordinarily safe for the past 2 decades. We have to remember, though, and you're quite right, the Pensacola incident was a tragedy, but we had a lot of close calls. Underwear bomber, for example, Najibullah Zazi attempting to pull off a copycat of the 7/7/05 London attacks, the Times Square bomb that because of poor training. So the terrorists haven't stopped. I think what worries me the most is 2 things. Firstly, beyond any doubt, we were tactically successful at eliminating terrorist enemies, mostly killing in latter years, but certainly capturing and killing in the beginning years. We learned that invading and occupying countries was not a road to success and probably brought more problems than it didn't. And by the 20-teens, we had modest military and intelligence assets positioned abroad to do exactly what President Bush had talked about after 9/11, to fight them there so we don't have to fight them here. And we've been successful. Also in the United States, there could be lots of criticism that counterterrorism became an industry, but as you just said, proof of the pudding is that there was only one successful incident. What worries me is that whether out of complacency, whether out of political expediency, whether because exactly as bin Laden promised us in one of his last publicly released videotapes in October 2004, he was going to bankrupt us, what we're systematically paring back lots of those capabilities, whether it's in the intelligence community where there's this massive shift away from counterterrorism. That isn't the only threat, but it's not a zero threat. What we see in the Justice Department and DHS, where a lot of the programs and a lot of the personnel that kept us safe are being dismantled. Our forward presence in many countries has certainly been pared back, and that to me is problematical and worrisome. I thought that we had gotten it right in the 20-teens, but as Brian has written about this many times, is that as time recedes from the canonical terrorist incident, we become complacent, we lower our guard, and once again, that's precisely when terrorists see the opportunity to strike. And let's face it too, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we basically had one enemy, in more or less one place. I mean, that's an oversimplification. I mean, gosh, there's 5 times as many Salafi jihadi groups on the State Department's FTO list, and they're in Africa, places in Asia, and so on. We have domestic terrorism. Your question about right-wing terrorism. We weren't worried about domestic terrorism adversaries, whether left or right or nihilist. In other words, the waterfront's gotten more complicated precisely at a time where I think we're failing to understand the lessons of 9/11. And in many respects, I feel we're almost going back to the 1990s, seeing a world that we want it to be rather than the world that exists.
Brian, Bruce mentioned FTOs, foreign terrorist organizations, and obviously we had a Secretary of Defense, now Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, explained that the attack on the Venezuelan boat, supposedly carrying drugs, but certainly carrying 11 people, was an attack against narco-terrorists. Now, he was very vague about the legal underpinnings of this basis, and he didn't refer to the foreign terrorist designation, although surely that must be part of the legal rationale. But are you surprised that, in a sense, the war on terror kind of logic has been now applied to these drug cartels? And were you surprised, in particular, by this attack on the Venezuelan boat?
In terms of the the designation, again, there's been a kind of a long-term development in that regard. And that is, and the pressure comes both from the public and it comes within government, that because there has been a measure of success in dealing with the terrorist threat, and also because, in a sense, calling something terrorism is a way of elevating it in the political discussion. And there's public pressure for this as well, in a sense that in some of the cases even that took place in the United States with so-called homegrown jihadists, I'm not entirely sure, again, back to this thing of how much of that was motivated by an ideology and how much of it reflected personal problems. But the public demanded and continues to demand, when there is an extraordinary act of violence, that we call it terrorism, and somehow the belief that doing so will bring the resources and result in a more effective effort. I mean, there was great pressure after the Las Vegas mass shooting to, let's call it terrorism, and then we'll do it. And even within the Department of Homeland Security, they sort of blended a bit in some of the past strategic documents, active shooters, targeted violence, and terrorism, and that was getting a bit blurry. With regard to the drug cartels, therefore, it wasn't surprising that there was this long time pressure that we'll call them terrorists, and then that will somehow enable us to do something that we could not do otherwise. By the way, in terms of the designation, in part, those designations of foreign terrorist organizations were to arm the authorities with the same statutes and authority that they had in dealing with organized crime already. So it's not as if we lacked statutes to deal with drug traffickers and people laundering money and to deal with organized crime. And so that's funny. Declaring a group a foreign terrorist organization does not, it puts it in a military lane conceptually, politically. It does not provide additional legal authority automatically to carry out an act of violence.
So that is under Article 2, the president's right to, as commander-in-chief.
Again, not an international lawyer.
Yeah.
He does have authority under Article 2, but Article 2 refers to taking action to defend the country in immediate circumstances, and whether...
I mean, is this a case where some lawyer somewhere in the DOD is going to say it's okay? I mean,
Oh, no, there's no question about it.
Obviously, they had some legal piece of paper that said this was kosher.
It's contested ground, and you can find a lawyer. You can find a lawyer to, we could declare a ham sandwich a terrorist organization and consume it. But so the attack in Venezuela was out of the norm in the sense that we are constantly, we stop and search and seize cargo and arrest drug smugglers in the Caribbean all the time, hundreds and hundreds of them. I mean, we're so good at locating that boat and attacking that boat because we have this infrastructure in place to track these vessels, to track communications, and in this case, what is, there were in fact 2 decoy boats out ahead of that boat, and we weren't fooled by that. So in terms of our capabilities, no question, we can blow a boat out of the water. What does it do? It sends a signal that, yes, we're going to be tough about this. Is it going to significantly disrupt the The drug traffic? We'll wait and see on that. I'm skeptical. By the way, can I just make two quick?
Brian, actually,
all right.
in the interest of time,
Oh, we got.
I'm good.
yes. All right.
I'm going to say thank you very much, Dame Louise Richardson. Thank you very much, Dr. Bruce Hoffman. And thank you, Brian Jenkins. And thank you to the audience. And that's a wrap.